The golden sun of 1956 Los Angeles cast long shadows across the bustling streets of Hollywood Boulevard. Neon signs flickered to life as evening approached, advertising the latest pictures from the major studios. The city hummed with the energy of dreams being made and broken, where every soda jerk harbored aspirations of stardom, and every secretary believed she could be the next Grace Kelly. In the heart of this glittering world stood two entertainment empires, locked in a bitter rivalry that had consumed the industry for over a decade. The Montague family controlled Montague Pictures, one of the last great independent film studios, famous for their sweeping romantic dramas and epic westerns that had defined cinema's golden age. Their lot sprawled across 20 acres in Burbank, complete with sound stages that had hosted legends like Clark Gable and Bette Davis. Across town, the Capulet family had built their fortune in the emerging world of television. Capulet Broadcasting Network operated from a sleek, modern building on Sunset Strip, its glass facade reflecting the changing times. While the Montagues clung to the grandeur of classic Hollywood, the Capulets embraced the future, producing variety shows, sitcoms, and live dramatic presentations that were drawing audiences away from movie theaters and into their living rooms. The feud between these two dynasties had begun in the aftermath of World War II, when television started its relentless march into American homes. Vincent Montague, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver temples and expensive suits, viewed television as a vulgar threat to the art of cinema. He often declared at industry gatherings that television would never replace the magic of the big screen, that families gathering around a tiny box in their parlors could never match the communal experience of a darkened theater. Meanwhile, Carlo Capulet, equally distinguished but more forward-thinking, saw television as the democratic future of entertainment. He believed that bringing quality programming directly into people's homes would create a more intimate connection between performers and audiences. His network studios buzzed with activity as directors adapted to the constraints of live broadcasts and actors learned to perform for cameras positioned mere feet away. The rivalry had escalated over the years through stolen talent, competing projects, and bitter court battles over distribution rights. Trade papers like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter chronicled each skirmish with the fervor of war correspondence. When Montague Pictures signed an exclusive deal with a major theater chain, Capulet Broadcasting would retaliate by poaching their biggest stars for television specials. The industry watched these battles with fascination and growing concern, as the endless warfare was beginning to damage both empires. On this particular evening, the Sunset Strip glowed with the promise of another glamorous Hollywood night. Classic automobiles, Cadillacs, Buicks, and Chryslers cruised past the famous nightclubs and restaurants where studio executives made deals over martinis and starlets, hoped to catch the eye of influential producers. The air carried the scent of jasmine and ambition, mixed with the exhaust of countless cars carrying dreamers to their destinies. Into this world of glittering facades and bitter rivalries stepped Romeo Montague, a young man of 22, whose dark eyes held the kind of brooding intensity that casting directors dreamed of discovering. Unlike his father Vincent, who commanded boardrooms with the authority of an old-world patriarch, Romeo possessed the restless energy of his generation. He had returned from Korea the previous year, where he'd served as a combat photographer, and the experience had left him with a deeper understanding of life's fragility than most Hollywood princes possessed. Romeo worked reluctantly in his father's studio, officially serving as an assistant producer, but spending most of his time wandering the backlots, observing the intricate dance of movie-making with the detached fascination of an outsider. He preferred the company of writers and cinematographers to executives, finding their creative struggles more honest than the political maneuvering that consumed the front office. His lean frame was usually clad in casual slacks and white shirts with rolled sleeves, a deliberate rejection of the formal business attire his father favored. On this evening, Romeo sat in his red Thunderbird convertible outside Mel's Drive-In on Sunset Boulevard, picking at a cheeseburger while his best friend Mercutio held court with their usual crowd of industry offspring and aspiring actors. Mercutio was everything Romeo was not: gregarious, irreverent, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. His father produced comedy shows for one of the smaller television networks, which allowed him to move freely between the Montague and Capulet circles without taking sides in their war. "You know what your problem is, Romeo?" Mercutio declared, gesturing dramatically with a French fry. "You think too much." This town's got the most beautiful women in the world, more parties than you can count, and enough excitement to kill a lesser man, and you sit there brooding like Hamlet in a Chevy commercial." The group around them laughed, a collection of young Hollywood royalty who spent their evenings cruising between drive-ins, nightclubs, and beach parties. There was Benvolio, Romeo's gentle cousin who worked as a junior agent at his uncle's talent agency, always trying to keep peace between the various feuding factions of their social circle. Paris, a rising television director whose father produced variety shows for Capulet Broadcasting, represented the enemy camp but was tolerated because of his genuine talent and diplomatic nature. "Maybe I'm just tired of the whole scene," Romeo replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone far older than his years. "All these people pretending to be something they're not. All this fighting over territory that might not even matter in 10 years. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if we all just stopped playing the game." Mercutio rolled his eyes and climbed onto the hood of the Thunderbird, addressing the group like a circus ringmaster. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Romeo Montague, the only man in Hollywood who's depressed by success. His family owns a studio that's made more money than Fort Knox. He's got looks that could launch 1,000 screen tests, and he's worried about the meaning of life." The teasing was good-natured, but Romeo felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. Everyone assumed he would eventually take over Montague Pictures, that he would continue the family legacy of producing the sweeping epics and romantic dramas that had built their fortune. But Romeo had seen too much in Korea, had witnessed too much genuine human drama, to find satisfaction in manufacturing artificial emotions for paying audiences. As the group prepared to move on to their next destination, probably the Coconut Grove or Ciro's, where they would dance to the latest hits from Sinatra and Martin, Romeo found himself thinking about the girl he had glimpsed that afternoon at a casting call. She had been auditioning for a small role in one of their upcoming pictures, and something about her presence had struck him as remarkably authentic in a town built on illusion. Meanwhile, across the city in the gleaming offices of Capulet Broadcasting Network, Juliet Capulet sat in her father's executive conference room, surrounded by the trappings of television's golden age. The walls were lined with awards and photographs of her father posing with famous performers, Milton Berle, Ed Sullivan, and other pioneers of the new medium. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the bustling activity of Sunset Strip below, where neon signs advertised the latest night spots, and the sidewalks teemed with hopeful actors carrying headshots in manila envelopes. At 17, Juliet possessed a luminous beauty that cameras instinctively loved, the kind of natural grace that made studio executives dream of discovering the next big star. Her auburn hair was styled in the fashionable pageboy cut that Audrey Hepburn had made popular, and she wore a powder blue dress with a cinched waist that epitomized feminine elegance of the era. But unlike many Hollywood daughters, who were content to serve as decorative accessories at industry functions, Juliet harbored serious ambitions of her own. She had spent the afternoon in one of the network's smaller studios, observing a live broadcast of Capulet Playhouse, her father's prestigious dramatic anthology series. The show featured established Broadway actors performing condensed versions of classic plays for television audiences, and Juliet found herself mesmerized by the intimate intensity that the medium demanded. Unlike film actors who could rely on multiple takes and careful editing, television performers had to capture lightning in a bottle during live broadcasts, knowing that millions of viewers were watching their every gesture in real time. Her nurse and constant companion, Maria Santos, a warm-hearted woman who had raised Juliet since infancy, sat nearby reviewing the guest list for tomorrow evening's gala. The Capulet family was hosting their annual industry celebration at the Ambassador Hotel's Coconut Grove, a lavish affair designed to showcase their network's growing influence and attract new talent to their stable of performers. "Your father wants you to pay special attention to Paris tomorrow night," Maria mentioned casually, though her tone carried deeper implications. "He's quite taken with you, Mija, and his connections in the industry could be very beneficial for the network." Juliet sighed, a sound that seemed to carry all the weight of a young woman trapped between duty and desire. Paris was undeniably handsome and talented, with a kind of smooth sophistication that made him popular at Hollywood parties. His family's production company created some of television's most successful variety shows, and a marriage between the Capulets and his family would create a powerful alliance in the rapidly evolving entertainment landscape. But something about the calculated nature of the arrangement troubled Juliet's romantic heart. She had grown up surrounded by the artificial emotions of television dramas, and she yearned for something genuine, something that couldn't be scripted or directed. When she watched the great actresses perform, Grace Kelly's elegant restraint, Marilyn Monroe's vulnerable sensuality, Elizabeth Taylor's passionate intensity, she sensed depths of feeling that seemed to transcend mere performance. As evening settled over Los Angeles, the city transformed into a glittering wonderland of possibility. The famous Hollywood sign gleamed white against the darkening hills, while below, the entertainment industry prepared for another night of deal-making and dream-spinning. In restaurants like the Brown Derby and Musso and Frank, agents negotiated contracts over steaks and martinis, while aspiring starlets served coffee and practiced their smiles, hoping to catch the eye of someone who could change their lives forever. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds: the fading grandeur of classic Hollywood cinema and the emerging power of television, represented by two young people who had never met, but whose destinies were about to intertwine in ways that would challenge everything their families believed about love, loyalty, and the price of fame in America's dream factory. Tomorrow night's party at the Coconut Grove would bring together the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry, all gathered under the swaying palm fronds and twinkling lights of Hollywood's most glamorous ballroom, unaware that they were about to witness the beginning of a love story that would shake their world to its foundations. The Ambassador Hotel's Coconut Grove blazed with the golden light of 1,000 bulbs on Saturday evening, transforming the legendary ballroom into a shimmering palace of entertainment royalty. Paper palm trees swayed gently from the ceiling, their fronds casting dancing shadows across tables draped in crisp white linen and adorned with exotic orchids flown in from Hawaii that morning. The air hummed with the sophisticated chatter of Hollywood's elite, punctuated by the smooth melodies of a 12-piece orchestra, led by a conductor in white tails who had arranged music for some of the greatest films of the past decade. Carlo Capulet moved through the crowd like a benevolent monarch surveying his kingdom, his silver hair perfectly pomaded and his black tuxedo tailored to perfection. He paused frequently to shake hands with network executives, embrace famous performers, and pose for photographs with gossip columnists, whose words could make or break careers with a single poisonous sentence. His wife, Elena, radiated elegance in a sapphire blue gown that caught the light with each graceful movement, playing the perfect hostess while keeping a watchful eye on their daughter. Juliet stood near the orchestra, wearing a flowing white evening gown that made her appear to glow against the ballroom's golden ambiance. The dress, designed by Adrian himself, featured delicate beadwork that sparkled like captured starlight, and her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon adorned with a single white gardenia. She smiled politely as her father introduced her to various industry dignitaries, but her eyes held a distant quality, as if she were performing a role rather than living her life. Paris appeared at her side with the timing of a perfectly choreographed dance number, resplendent in his tuxedo and radiating the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He was undeniably handsome, with the kind of classic features that photographed well, and the smooth charm that made him popular at every party. When he asked Juliet to dance, she accepted with the grace expected of a well-bred Hollywood daughter, allowing him to lead her onto the polished floor where other couples swayed to the romantic strains of Moonlight Serenade. "You look absolutely radiant tonight," Paris murmured as they moved together, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "I've been looking forward to this evening all week. Your father mentioned that you might be interested in appearing on one of our variety shows. I could arrange a screen test whenever you're ready." Juliet managed a smile, though something about the calculated nature of his courtship made her feel like a business acquisition rather than a woman being wooed. "That's very kind of you, Paris, though I'm not certain I'm ready for the spotlight quite yet." Meanwhile, across the city, Romeo sat in Mercutio's Cadillac convertible as they cruised down Sunset Boulevard toward the Ambassador Hotel. What had begun as a casual evening of bar hopping had transformed into something far more dangerous when Mercutio had produced 3 invitation cards to the Capulet Gala, acquired through his network of industry connections and his talent for charming secretaries into bending rules. "This is insane," Romeo protested for the 3rd time, adjusting his black bow tie in the rearview mirror. "If my father discovers I attended a Capulet party, he'll probably disown me. And if Carlo Capulet recognizes me, we'll be thrown out before we reach the bar." Mercutio laughed, his eyes bright with mischief as he navigated through the evening traffic. "That's exactly why we have to go. When's the last time you did something genuinely spontaneous? Besides, these Hollywood parties are all the same, a bunch of people pretending to have more fun than they're actually having while making deals that will be broken by Tuesday. At least this way, we'll have some real excitement. Benvolio, ever the peacemaker, sat in the back seat, looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo. Maybe we should just go to the Mocambo instead. I heard Sinatra might drop by later, and there's less chance of starting World War III. But Romeo found himself curious about the enemy camp, drawn by the same restless energy that had made him volunteer for dangerous photography assignments in Korea. He had heard stories about the Capulet parties, their legendary hospitality, their cutting-edge entertainment, and their reputation for showcasing the best of television's emerging talent. Despite his family's fierce loyalty to cinema, Romeo couldn't deny his fascination with the new medium that was reshaping American culture. As Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio approached the Ambassador Hotel, the building rose before them like a cream-colored palace against the star-filled California sky. Valets in crisp white uniforms directed a parade of luxury automobiles, gleaming Rolls-Royces, elegant Packards, and sporty Jaguars, into perfect formation along the curved driveway. The hotel's famous neon sign cast a warm pink glow over the arriving guests, while searchlights swept dramatically across the heavens, announcing to all of Los Angeles that something spectacular was happening within these walls. The trio walked through the ornate lobby, their footsteps echoing on polished marble floors adorned with Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks from the coffered ceiling, while uniformed bellhops glided silently between towering arrangements of white roses and exotic birds of paradise. The very air seemed to shimmer with wealth and possibility, carrying the mingled fragrances of expensive perfumes and premium cigars. At the entrance to the Coconut Grove, Romeo hesitated for a moment, struck by the overwhelming opulence of the scene before him. The ballroom stretched out like a golden ocean, filled with Hollywood's most powerful figures dressed in their evening finest. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos moved with the confident swagger of those accustomed to commanding million-dollar budgets, while women draped in silk and diamonds glided across the floor like graceful swans, their jewelry catching the light with each subtle movement. "Remember," Mercutio whispered with theatrical intensity, "we're television executives from back east, scouting talent for a new dramatic series. Stick to the story, don't mention your last names, and for the love of Louis B. Mayer, don't let anyone photograph you near the Capulet family." The orchestra launched into a spirited rendition of "That Old Black Magic," and the crowd seemed to pulse with renewed energy. Romeo found himself swept along by the current of conversation and laughter, accepting champagne from passing waiters and nodding politely, as Mercutio introduced him to various television personalities, whose names he recognized from the trade papers, but whose faces had been unfamiliar until now. Then, across the crowded ballroom, he saw her. Juliet stood near the orchestra pit, and for Romeo, time seemed to slow to the pace of a romantic ballad. The golden light of the chandeliers seemed to focus on her like a perfectly calculated spotlight, making her white gown glow with an almost ethereal radiance. When she laughed at something Paris was saying, the sound carried across the room like silver bells, cutting through the ambient noise with crystal clarity. Her movements possessed a natural grace that made every other woman in the room seem to be trying too hard, and when she turned her head, her profile was illuminated with the kind of perfect lighting that cinematographers spent hours attempting to achieve. Romeo felt as if he had been struck by lightning, every nerve ending suddenly alive with an intensity he had never experienced. This wasn't the casual attraction he had felt for the starlets and socialites who populated his usual social circle. This was something deeper, more profound, like recognition of a truth he hadn't known he was seeking. "Who is that?" he asked a passing waiter, indicating Juliet with a subtle nod. The waiter, accustomed to such inquiries at Hollywood gatherings, followed Romeo's gaze and smiled knowingly. "That's Miss Juliet Capulet, sir. Mr. Capulet's daughter, quite the beauty, isn't she? Word is she might be making her television debut soon, though nothing's been announced officially." The name hit Romeo like a physical blow. Capulet. The enemy. The daughter of the man his father considered a vulgar destroyer of everything noble about the entertainment industry. Yet as he watched her excuse herself from Paris and move toward the terrace doors that led to the hotel's famous gardens, Romeo found himself following as if drawn by magnetic force. The Ambassador Hotel's legendary gardens stretched out beyond the ballroom like a carefully orchestrated dream sequence, illuminated by strings of tiny white lights that twinkled like earthbound constellations among the perfectly manicured hedges and exotic flowering plants. The air was sweet with the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and gardenias, while the distant sound of the orchestra drifted through the open terrace doors, muffled by the gentle splash of an ornate fountain whose cherub-adorned tears caught the moonlight like liquid silver. Juliet had escaped to this sanctuary, seeking a moment of solitude away from the calculated conversations and appraising glances that had dominated her evening. She stood beside a wrought iron bench, beneath a towering palm tree, her white gown seeming to glow in the romantic half-light as she gazed up at the stars that were still visible despite the city's growing neon embrace. The gardenia in her hair released its intoxicating perfume into the warm night air, creating an almost mystical atmosphere around her slender figure. Romeo appeared at the edge of the garden like a figure stepping out of a romantic film, his black tuxedo making him appear both elegant and slightly dangerous in the shadows cast by the swaying palm fronds. For a moment, he simply watched her, memorizing the way the moonlight played across her face and the graceful line of her neck as she tilted her head toward the heavens. Then, gathering his courage, he stepped forward into the circle of light surrounding the fountain. "I hope I'm not disturbing your peace," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach her without breaking the spell of the evening. "But I couldn't help noticing that you seem to be searching for something out here among the stars." Juliet turned toward him, and in that moment, both young people felt the world shift around them like a perfectly executed camera move. Her eyes, dark and luminous in the garden's romantic lighting, met his with an intensity that seemed to bypass all the usual social conventions and speak directly to something deeper and more essential. "Perhaps I was," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever magic was weaving itself around them, "though I'm not certain I knew what I was looking for until this moment." Romeo moved closer, drawn by the same inexorable force that had compelled him to follow her into the garden. "In the pictures my father produces, this is the moment where the orchestra would swell, and the camera would pull back to capture the romantic tableau. But this feels more real than any script I've ever read." Their conversation flowed with the easy intimacy of old friends, though they had known each other for mere minutes. They spoke of dreams and disappointments, of the pressure of living up to family expectations, and the yearning for something authentic in a world built on illusion. Romeo found himself telling her about his experiences in Korea, how witnessing genuine human drama had left him questioning the artificial emotions manufactured by Hollywood. Juliet shared her conflicted feelings about the entertainment industry, her desire to find meaningful work while navigating the treacherous social waters of her father's world. As they talked, they gradually moved closer together, drawn by a magnetic pull that seemed to operate beyond conscious thought. When Romeo reached out to adjust the gardenia that was slipping from her hair, their hands touched, and both felt an electric shock of connection that made the rest of the world fade into insignificance. "I should probably tell you," Juliet said, though her voice lacked conviction, "that my name is Juliet Capulet. If you know anything about this industry, that name probably means something to you." Romeo felt his heart stop, then restart with doubled intensity. "And I should tell you that I'm Romeo Montague, which means we're supposed to be enemies." The weight of their family names hung between them like a heavy curtain, but neither made any move to step away. Instead, they seemed to draw even closer, as if proximity could somehow dissolve the barriers that their birthright had erected between them. The weeks following the Ambassador Hotel Gala passed like scenes from a beautifully crafted romantic film, each day bringing new chapters to a love story that bloomed in the shadows of Hollywood's glittering facade. Romeo and Juliet began meeting in secret, finding moments of stolen intimacy amid the carefully choreographed chaos of the entertainment industry. Their romance unfolding against a backdrop of studio lots, hidden nightclubs, and moonlit drives along the Pacific Coast Highway. Their first clandestine encounter took place 3 days after the party, at a small coffee shop on Melrose Avenue called The Scene, a bohemian gathering place favored by writers, struggling actors, and other creative souls who existed on the margins of mainstream Hollywood. The establishment occupied a converted bungalow painted in deep burgundy, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in photographs of forgotten film stars and abstract paintings created by hopeful artists who paid their rent by waiting tables at more prestigious restaurants. Romeo arrived first, claiming a corner booth beneath a faded poster from a 1940 seconds film noir, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had grown cold while he waited. He wore casual clothes, gray slacks, a white Oxford shirt, and a navy blazer, but his nervous energy made him appear as formally dressed as if he were attending a premiere. When Juliet entered wearing a simple yellow sundress and white cardigan, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, the entire coffee shop seemed to brighten with her presence. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing with the easy intimacy of souls recognizing their perfect complement. Romeo spoke of his dreams of creating meaningful films that captured authentic human experiences rather than the manufactured emotions that dominated studio productions. Juliet shared her vision of television as a medium capable of bringing sophisticated drama directly into American homes, of creating a more democratic form of entertainment that could reach people regardless of their economic circumstances. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a beautiful prison," Juliet confessed, stirring cream into her second cup of coffee while the afternoon sunlight streamed through the window beside their table. "Everyone expects me to be grateful for the privilege of being Carlo Capulet's daughter, to smile gracefully at industry functions, and eventually marry someone who will enhance the family's television empire. But I want to create something meaningful, not just serve as a decorative accessory to someone else's ambitions." Romeo reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, marveling at the way her skin seemed to glow in the golden California light. "Then create something meaningful. Your father may have built his empire on television, but that doesn't mean you have to follow his exact blueprint. Maybe you're meant to take the medium in directions he never imagined." Their secret courtship continued through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings at locations chosen for their anonymity, a jazz club in Venice Beach, where the dim lighting and experimental music provided perfect camouflage for intimate conversations, a drive-in movie theater in the San Fernando Valley, where they could talk privately in Romeo's Thunderbird while Rebel Without a Cause played on the enormous screen, and long walks along the Malibu shore, where the sound of crashing waves masked their whispered declarations of love. Within 2 weeks, they had reached a level of emotional intimacy that neither had experienced before. Romeo found himself sharing memories of Korea that he had never discussed with anyone, while Juliet revealed her deepest fears about living up to her family's expectations while remaining true to her own artistic vision. They discovered a shared love of poetry, photography, and the experimental jazz musicians who were beginning to revolutionize American music from small clubs scattered throughout Los Angeles. Their physical attraction intensified with each meeting, charged by the forbidden nature of their romance and the constant danger of discovery. When Romeo finally kissed her during their third encounter, standing beside his car in a secluded parking area overlooking the city lights, both felt as if they had discovered fire. The kiss was tender yet passionate, filled with all the yearning and desperation of young love that knows it exists against impossible odds. "This is madness," Juliet whispered against his lips, her arms wrapped around his neck as the distant sounds of the city provided a romantic soundtrack to their embrace. "If our families discover what we're doing, then we'll face whatever comes together," Romeo replied, his voice husky with emotion, as he held her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. "I've never felt anything like this before, Juliet. I've dated actresses and socialites, gone through all the motions of romance that Hollywood expects, but this feels like the first real thing that's ever happened to me." As their secret romance deepened through the sultry summer of 1956, Romeo and Juliet found themselves taking increasingly dangerous risks to be together. Their meetings became more frequent and more daring, driven by a passion that grew stronger with each stolen moment. Romeo began using his connections at Montague Pictures to create alibis for his absences, claiming to scout locations or meet with potential writers while actually rendezvousing with Juliet at hidden corners of the sprawling city. Their most treasured sanctuary became a small apartment in Santa Monica that belonged to Father Lawrence, an elderly Catholic priest who had served as unofficial chaplain to the entertainment industry for over 20 years. Father Lawrence had married countless Hollywood couples, baptized their children, and provided spiritual counsel during the inevitable scandals and divorces that punctuated celebrity lives. His modest dwelling, furnished with simple wooden furniture and walls lined with books on theology and philosophy, offered a peaceful refuge from the artificial glitter of their usual world. Romeo had first approached the priest, seeking guidance about his crisis of faith in his family's industry, Drawn by Father Lawrence's reputation for wisdom and discretion, the older man, whose silver hair and gentle eyes reflected decades of hearing confessions and offering comfort, had listened patiently as Romeo struggled to articulate his feelings about love, duty, and the seemingly irreconcilable differences between the Montague and Capulet empires. "Love, my son, is not a sin," Father Lawrence had counseled during one of their evening conversations, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human experience. But it can become destructive when it exists in defiance of all reason and prudence. The question you must ask yourself is whether your feelings for this young woman spring from genuine affection or from the thrill of rebellion against your family's expectations. When Romeo brought Juliet to meet the priest, Father Lawrence was immediately struck by the genuine nature of their connection. He watched as they sat together on his simple sofa, their hands intertwined, their eyes holding the kind of pure devotion that he had rarely witnessed, even among the most celebrated romantic partnerships of Hollywood's golden age. The way they looked at each other, the gentle consideration they showed for each other's words, the obvious joy they took in simply being in the same room, all of it convinced him that their love was authentic rather than merely the product of youthful infatuation. "Father," Juliet had said during their second meeting, her voice trembling with nervous determination, "Romeo and I want to be married. We know the obstacles we face, understand the pain this might cause our families, but we also know that what we feel for each other is real and lasting. We're asking for your blessing and your help." The priest studied their young faces, seeing both the radiant hope of new love and the shadows of the tragedy that often befell those who dared to challenge the established order. "Marriage is a sacred sacrament, not to be entered into lightly or as an act of defiance. Are you prepared for the consequences of such a decision? Your family's feud runs deep, and your union could escalate their conflict rather than heal it." Romeo leaned forward, his dark eyes intense with conviction. "Father, I've spent my entire life watching my family wage war against people they've never truly tried to understand. The Capulets aren't monsters. They're innovators who see the future of entertainment differently than we do. If Juliet and I can bridge that gap through our love, perhaps we can show both families that their hatred serves no purpose beyond destroying lives and opportunities." Over the following weeks, as July melted into August and the California heat shimmered off the concrete of Hollywood Boulevard, the young couple spent countless hours in Father Lawrence's peaceful apartment, discussing their future and preparing for the clandestine wedding ceremony they had scheduled for the last Saturday of the month. They planned to marry quietly, with only Father Lawrence and Maria Santos, Juliet's devoted nurse, who had agreed to serve as witness, in attendance. The ceremony would take place at dawn in the priest's small garden, surrounded by roses and orange trees that perfumed the morning air with their sweet fragrance. Afterward, they would return to their respective families and continue their charade of indifference until Romeo could find the right moment to approach both fathers and announce their marriage as a fait accompli, hoping that their love could serve as the foundation for a lasting peace between the warring houses. But even as they made these hopeful plans, the entertainment industry around them was reaching a boiling point of tension that would soon make their secret impossible to maintain. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August, when the temperature in downtown Los Angeles soared past 95 degrees and tempers throughout the entertainment industry reached a similar boiling point. The catalyst was a seemingly innocent business lunch at the prestigious Brown Derby restaurant on Vine Street, where the burgundy leather booths and caricatures of famous stars provided an elegant backdrop for the deals and betrayals that shaped Hollywood's destiny. Tybalt Capulet, Juliet's fiery cousin and Carlo's heir apparent at the network, had arranged the meeting with several prominent television advertisers who were considering switching their sponsorship dollars from Montague Pictures' theatrical releases to Capulet Broadcasting's primetime programming. Tybalt was a magnetic figure in his early 30s, with the kind of dangerous charm that made him equally popular with starlets and feared by business rivals. His black hair was always perfectly styled, his suits impeccably tailored, and his smile carried the predatory gleam of a shark sensing blood in the water. The lunch had proceeded smoothly until Mercutio and Benvolio entered the restaurant, having arranged their own business meeting with a potential client at a nearby table. Mercutio, ever the showman, was regaling his companions with an animated story about a disastrous live television broadcast when his voice carried across the intimate dining room inadvertently interrupting Tybalt's carefully orchestrated presentation to the advertising executives. "Excuse me," Tybalt said, rising from his booth with the fluid grace of a panther, his voice carrying the kind of cold politeness that veteran Hollywood observers recognized as a prelude to violence. "But perhaps you gentlemen could conduct your amateur hour elsewhere. Some of us are conducting serious business here." The restaurant's typical afternoon buzz gradually died away as other diners sensed the electricity crackling between the two groups. Waiters froze in mid-stride, their silver trays balanced precariously, while the maitre d' moved nervously toward a telephone, prepared to call for assistance if the situation escalated beyond verbal sparring. Mercutio, never one to back down from a confrontation, especially when alcohol had loosened his already flexible relationship with discretion, stood up with theatrical flair. "Tybalt Capulet, as I live and breathe. Tell me, are you still producing those dreadful variety shows where has-been vaudevillians embarrass themselves for the amusement of housewives in Kansas? Or have you graduated to something requiring actual talent?" The insult hung in the air like a slap across the face. Tybalt's dark eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, and his hand moved instinctively to straighten his tie, a gesture that those who knew him recognized as a warning sign of impending explosion. The advertising executives at his table shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their decision to attend this particular lunch meeting. Before Tybalt could respond, Romeo appeared in the restaurant's entrance, having arranged to meet Mercutio for what he hoped would be a quiet conversation about his upcoming secret wedding. He wore a light gray suit and carried himself with the distracted air of a man whose thoughts were entirely occupied by romantic anticipation. But as he approached their table, he immediately sensed the dangerous tension crackling through the elegant dining room. "Mercutio," Romeo said quietly, placing a restraining hand on his friend's arm, "perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere. I'm sure Mr. Comanchin, Capulet has more important matters to attend to than our trivial concerns." But Tybalt had recognized Romeo, and his expression transformed into something approaching savage joy. Romeo Montague. How fitting. The prince of yesterday's entertainment industry, clinging to his father's outdated notions about the superiority of moving pictures. "Tell me, Romeo, does it pain you to watch television steal your audience, one family at a time?" Romeo felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated stress and secret guilt. For weeks, he had been living a double life, professing loyalty to his family while betraying their fundamental beliefs through his relationship with Juliet. The constant pressure of deception, combined with Tybalt's deliberate provocations, created a volatile mixture that threatened to explode without warning. "I have no quarrel with you, Tybalt," Romeo replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Your family's success in television doesn't diminish what my father has accomplished in cinema. There's room in this industry for both mediums to thrive." The conciliatory response only seemed to inflame Tybalt's aggressive instincts. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried clearly through the silent restaurant. "How noble of you to be so diplomatic, Romeo. But diplomacy won't save your family when television renders movie theaters as obsolete as Nickelodeon's." The confrontation at the Brown Derby erupted into violence with the sudden intensity of a flash flood in the desert. Mercutio, his face flushed with righteous indignation and expensive whiskey, pushed past Romeo's restraining hand and advanced on Tybalt with the reckless bravado that had made him simultaneously beloved and feared throughout Hollywood's social circles. "You want to discuss obsolescence, cousin?" Mercutio snarled, his usual charm replaced by something darker and more dangerous. "Let's talk about how your precious television network peddles the same tired formulas to audiences too lazy to leave their living rooms. At least when people attend our pictures, they're seeking genuine artistry, not just background noise for their dinner conversations." The restaurant had become a theater, with every patron and employee frozen in fascination, as two of Hollywood's most prominent young figures prepared to destroy each other over principles that seemed to matter more than their lives. The maitre d' had abandoned his telephone call, recognizing that any intervention would only escalate the situation beyond control. Tybalt's response came in the form of a crystal water glass hurled with deadly accuracy at Mercutio's head. The heavy tumbler shattered against the wall behind them, sending shards of glass cascading across the burgundy carpet like fallen stars. The sound seemed to release all the pent-up tension in the room, and suddenly both men were grappling with each other, overturning tables and sending plates crashing to the floor in a symphony of destruction. Romeo threw himself between them, desperate to prevent the violence from escalating beyond the point of no return. But in the confusion of flying fists and overturned furniture, his attempts at peacemaking only added to the chaos. As he struggled to separate the two combatants, Tybalt's elbow connected with his ribs, sending a spike of pain through his chest, while Mercutio's wild swing caught him across the jaw with enough force to fill his mouth with the metallic taste of blood. The fight spilled out of the restaurant and onto Vine Street, where the afternoon heat and gathering crowd of onlookers created an almost carnival atmosphere. Photographers from the gossip magazines materialized as if by magic, their flashbulbs popping like miniature explosions as they captured every moment of the brawl for the next day's headlines. The sound of approaching sirens added an ominous soundtrack to the mayhem, but the combatants seemed oblivious to everything except their mutual desire for destruction. In the struggle that followed, as bodies twisted and fell across the hot pavement, Tybalt's hand found a broken piece of the restaurant's decorative wrought iron railing that had been damaged in the melee. Without conscious thought, driven by rage and family pride, he swung the improvised weapon in a wide arc that connected with Mercutio's temple with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a home run. Mercutio collapsed onto the sidewalk, his body going suddenly still as a spreading pool of crimson began to stain the concrete beneath his head. The crowd that had been cheering the fight fell silent. The photographers lowered their cameras, and even the approaching police sirens seemed to fade into background noise as the reality of what had happened settled over the scene like a suffocating blanket. Romeo knelt beside his friend's motionless form, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life that were already fading. Mercutio's eyes fluttered open for a moment, focusing on Romeo's face with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes in the final moments of consciousness. "A plague on both your houses," Mercutio whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing crowd. "They have made worms meat of me. I have it. And soundly too. Your houses. Both alike. In dignity. And in stupidity." The words were spoken with such quiet intensity that they seemed to hang in the air long after Mercutio's eyes had closed for the final time. Romeo felt something break inside his chest, a sound like glass shattering in an empty room, as he realized that his dearest friend had died because of a feud that neither of them had started but both had been powerless to escape. When Romeo looked up from Mercutio's body, his face was transformed. The gentle, a romantic young man who had spent the morning planning his secret wedding had been replaced by someone harder, colder, filled with a rage that burned like molten steel. His dark eyes fixed on Tybalt, who stood frozen beside the restaurant's entrance, the bloody piece of iron still clutched in his trembling hand, his face white with the dawning realization of what he had done. "Tybalt," Romeo said, his voice carrying across the silent street with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You took the life of the best man I've ever known. Now you'll answer for it." The confrontation that followed unfolded with the inexorable momentum of a Greek tragedy, played out against the backdrop of Hollywood's most glamorous boulevard, while shocked onlookers watched two young men destroy their futures over a conflict that neither fully understood. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete, creating wavering heat mirages that made the entire scene appear dreamlike and unreal, as if the violence were being filmed through a camera lens smeared with petroleum jelly. Romeo advanced on Tybalt with the measured pace of a gunfighter approaching a showdown, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something primal and dangerous that seemed to emanate from his very core. His gray suit was torn and bloodstained, his dark hair disheveled, and his hands clenched into fists that trembled with barely contained fury. The crowd instinctively backed away from him, sensing the transformation that grief and rage had wrought in the young heir to the Montague Empire. Tybalt, still clutching the piece of twisted iron that had ended Mercutio's life, seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had done. His perfectly styled hair was now plastered to his forehead with perspiration, his expensive suit rumpled and stained, and his dark eyes held the wild look of a man who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The weapon in his hand shook like a leaf in a hurricane, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with a combination of fear and defiance. I didn't mean for him to die," Tybalt stammered, backing toward the restaurant's brick wall as Romeo continued his relentless approach. "It was just supposed to be a warning, a lesson about respecting the Capulet name." But he wouldn't stop, wouldn't listen to reason. He forced my hand with his constant provocations and insults. Romeo's response came not in words but in action, as he lunged forward with the desperate fury of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. His fist connected with Tybalt's jaw with a sound like a sledgehammer striking concrete, sending the other man sprawling across the sidewalk. The piece of iron went flying, clattering into the gutter where it lay like a discarded prop from some nightmarish film production. The fight that followed was brutal and one-sided, fueled by Romeo's grief and Tybalt's growing desperation. They grappled on the hot pavement, their expensive clothes tearing, and their bodies accumulating cuts and bruises that would have ended the careers of any actors foolish enough to sustain such damage. The crowd pressed closer despite the danger, mesmerized by the raw violence unfolding before them like spectators at some perverse sporting event. When Tybalt's head struck the concrete curb with a sickening crack, the sound seemed to echo through the canyon of buildings that lined Vine Street. His body went limp beneath Romeo's hands, and suddenly the street fell silent except for the distant wail of sirens that were growing steadily closer. Romeo knelt over his cousin-in-law's motionless form, his chest heaving with exertion and his knuckles bleeding from the impacts they had delivered. It took several moments for Romeo to realize what he had done, for the red haze of fury to clear enough for him to understand that Tybalt Capulet lay dead beneath the blazing California sun. The man who had been Juliet's beloved cousin, the heir to the television empire that Romeo had hoped to unite with his own family through love and marriage, would never draw another breath or utter another cruel word about the superiority of his medium over others. The photographers who had been capturing the fight suddenly resumed their frenzied activity, their flashbulbs creating a strobe light effect as they documented the aftermath of Hollywood's most shocking street fight. Romeo looked up to see dozens of faces staring at him with expressions ranging from horror to fascination, and he realized that his life as he had known it was over. Within hours, his photograph would be splashed across every newspaper in Los Angeles, his name would be synonymous with violence and tragedy, and his secret marriage to Juliet would become not a bridge between warring families, but the ultimate betrayal. Police officers appeared at the edge of the crowd, their blue uniforms stark against the Hollywood glamour that surrounded them like a grim reminder of reality intruding upon fantasy. Romeo made no attempt to resist as they approached, his hands hanging limply at his sides, as he stared down at the two bodies that represented the complete destruction of everything he had hoped to build with the woman he loved more than his own life. The last thing he saw before the handcuffs clicked around his wrists was Juliet herself, emerging from a taxi at the edge of the crowd, her face white with shock, as she took in the scene of carnage that had transformed her beloved cousin and her secret husband into the central figures of Hollywood's darkest tragedy. The scene that unfolded on Vine Street became the most photographed moment in Hollywood history, captured from dozens of angles by news photographers, gossip columnists, and shocked bystanders who had witnessed the violent end of an era. The images would dominate newspaper front pages across the nation the following morning. Romeo in handcuffs, his torn suit and bloodied hands a stark contrast to his usual elegant appearance. The two bodies covered by white sheets that fluttered in the warm afternoon breeze like surrendering flags. And most haunting of all, Juliet Capulet standing at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of devastation as she comprehended the magnitude of the tragedy that had destroyed her world. The police moved with efficient professionalism, establishing a perimeter around the crime scene while detectives began the grim process of documenting evidence and interviewing witnesses. The Brown Derby's burgundy awning provided a macabre backdrop for their work, its elegant lettering a reminder of the civilized world that had been shattered by a few moments of ungovernable rage. Ambulances arrived with sirens wailing, their red lights casting an eerie glow across the gathering dusk, as paramedics confirmed what everyone already knew, that Mercutio and Tybalt Capulet were beyond any earthly assistance. Juliet pushed through the crowd with the desperate determination of a woman trying to reach a sinking ship, her yellow sundress bright against the somber faces of the onlookers who parted before her like mourners at a funeral procession. When she reached the police barrier, she was close enough to see Romeo's face as the officers guided him toward their patrol car, close enough to witness the moment when his eyes found hers across the chaos and destruction. The look that passed between them contained entire conversations compressed into a single heartbreaking instant. Romeo's expression held not just grief for his friend and horror at his own actions, but a deeper anguish at the realization that he had destroyed any possibility of the life they had planned together. His marriage to Juliet, which was to have been announced the following week as a symbol of reconciliation between their warring families, would now be seen as the ultimate betrayal. the union of a murderer with his victim's cousin. Juliet's face reflected her struggle to reconcile the gentle, romantic man she had fallen in love with and the figure now being led away in handcuffs for killing her beloved cousin. Tybalt had been her protector since childhood, the older brother she had never had, who had taught her to drive his Jaguar and escorted her to her first Hollywood premieres. Yet Romeo was her husband, her soulmate, the man who had shown her what authentic love could feel like in a world built on artificial emotions and calculated relationships. Juliet. Maria Santos appeared at her side, the older woman's face etched with concern as she wrapped protective arms around her charge. "Mija, you shouldn't be here. Come, let me take you home before the reporters recognize you. This tragedy will be front-page news by morning, and your father must hear of it from family, not from the newspapers." But Juliet seemed unable to move, transfixed by the surreal scene unfolding before her. The Hollywood Boulevard she had known all her life, the glamorous thoroughfare where movie stars posed for photographs and tourists came to glimpse their idols, had been transformed into something from a film noir nightmare. The palm trees that lined the street swayed gently in the evening breeze, their fronds casting shifting shadows across the crime scene like the bars of a prison, while the famous neon signs began their nightly illumination, creating a carnival atmosphere that seemed grotesquely inappropriate for such a moment of tragedy. Television news crews were already setting up their equipment, their bright lights cutting through the gathering darkness as reporters prepared to broadcast the story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. The irony was not lost on those who understood the entertainment industry's Byzantine politics. The Capulet family's television empire would be reporting on the violent death of its own heir apparent, killed by the son of their greatest business rival in a street fight that seemed to belong to an earlier, more primitive era. As Romeo disappeared into the police car, his face visible for a moment through the rear window before the vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the traffic flowing down Vine Street, Juliet felt something die within her chest. The fairy tale romance that had sustained her through weeks of secret meetings and whispered promises was ending not with a wedding but with handcuffs and headlines, not with the merger of two entertainment dynasties but with the complete destruction of any hope for peace between the Montague and Capulet empires. The crowd began to disperse as the police completed their initial investigation and the bodies were removed to the county morgue, but the damage to Hollywood's carefully maintained facade of glamour and sophistication was permanent. The violent deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt Capulet would mark the end of an era of innocence, the moment when the entertainment industry's family feuds escalated from business competition to actual bloodshed, forever changing the way the world viewed the golden dream factory of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Jail stood like a concrete monument to shattered dreams in the heart of downtown, its gray walls and barred windows, a stark contrast to the glittering entertainment district that sprawled just miles away. Within its confines, Romeo Montague sat on a narrow cot in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, staring at headlines that screamed his name from every newspaper in California. "Hollywood Hair Kills Television Prince," proclaimed the Los Angeles Times, while Variety's front page featured photographs of both victims alongside the stark caption, "Industry Feud Turns Deadly." 3 days had passed since the street fight on Vine Street, 3 days during which Romeo had been transformed from promising young producer into the most notorious criminal in Hollywood history. His father's high-powered attorneys worked around the clock to secure his release on bail, but the district attorney, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate that justice applied equally to the wealthy and powerful, had declared Romeo a flight risk and denied all requests for pretrial freedom. The cell's single window offered a view of the city skyline, where the letters spelling Hollywood gleamed white against the brown hills like a cruel reminder of everything Romeo had lost. At night, he could see the glow of studio lights and the sweep of searchlights announcing premieres he would never attend. In a world that had already begun to forget his existence, the gentle, romantic young man who had spent August evenings planning a secret wedding had been replaced by a hollow-eyed figure whose hands still trembled when he remembered the sound of Tybalt's skull striking concrete. Meanwhile, across the city in the elegant Capulet mansion in Beverly Hills, Juliet faced her own form of imprisonment. The sprawling Spanish colonial estate, with its red tile roof and meticulously manicured gardens, had become a fortress of grief and rapidly evolving plans designed to salvage the family's reputation from the wreckage of the scandal. Carlo Capulet paced the marble floors of his study like a caged panther, his silver hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent calculating the damage to his television empire. "The board of directors is meeting tomorrow," he announced to his wife and daughter, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had watched his carefully constructed world crumble in 72 hours. "Three major sponsors have already threatened to pull their advertising, and the network affiliates are demanding assurance that we can weather this crisis. Tybalt was supposed to be my successor. And now..." His voice broke, unable to complete the sentence that would acknowledge his nephew's death and his daughter's unwitting role in the tragedy. Elena Capulet sat rigidly in a high-backed chair upholstered in cream silk, her elegant features composed in the kind of stoic mask that Hollywood wives learn to wear when confronting public disasters. "We must think of Juliet's future," she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap like white doves seeking shelter. "The girl cannot be associated with this violence any longer than necessary. Paris has been wonderfully supportive during this difficult time, and his family's production company could provide exactly the kind of stability our network needs." Juliet, dressed in black as befitted a period of mourning, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the swimming pool where she and Tybalt had spent countless childhood afternoons. The water reflected the late afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds, beautiful and peaceful in stark contrast to the turmoil churning through her heart. She had not spoken Romeo's name aloud since the arrest, knowing that any defense of her secret husband would be interpreted as betrayal of her dead cousin's memory. "Paris has asked for your hand in marriage," her father continued, his tone suggesting that the request was more command than invitation. "The ceremony will take place next Saturday at the Beverly Hills Hotel. A small affair, given the circumstances, but elegant enough to demonstrate that the Capulet family remains strong and unified despite this tragedy. The union will represent a new beginning for our network and a chance for you to build a life free from the shadows of recent events." The words hit Juliet like physical blows, each syllable driving home the impossibility of her situation. She was already married to Romeo, bound to him by vows spoken in Father Lawrence's garden beneath orange trees heavy with fruit and promise. Yet that marriage existed in a world that had been destroyed by violence, a secret that could never be revealed without destroying what remained of her family's standing in the community. "I understand, Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the palm trees outside. "Whatever you think is best for the family." But even as she spoke the words of submission, Juliet's mind raced toward desperate possibilities, searching for some way to escape the trap that circumstances had constructed around her heart. That evening, as the Beverly Hills streetlights cast long shadows through the eucalyptus trees that lined the Capulet estate, Juliet slipped out of the mansion, wearing a simple black coat over her dress, and drove her father's Packard through the winding roads that led to Santa Monica. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed through her open window, a reminder of the romantic drives she had shared with Romeo along the Pacific Coast Highway during those blissful weeks when their love had seemed capable of conquering any obstacle. Father Lawrence's modest apartment sat dark and quiet when she arrived, but a light appeared in the window moments after she knocked on the weathered door. The priest emerged wearing a simple bathrobe over his pajamas, his silver hair tousled from sleep, but his eyes immediately alert with concern when he saw her tear-stained face in the porch light's yellow glow. "Child, what brings you here at such an hour?" he asked gently, ushering her into the small living room where they had spent so many hopeful evenings planning for a future that now seemed impossible. "I've been praying for you since I heard the terrible news about your cousin and your husband's arrest." Juliet collapsed into the familiar armchair where she had sat just days earlier, discussing flower arrangements and honeymoon destinations with the innocent excitement of a young bride. Now those dreams felt like memories from someone else's life, beautiful but ultimately meaningless in the face of tragedy and family obligation. "Father, I need your help," she said, her voice breaking with desperation. "My parents are forcing me to marry Paris on Saturday. They don't know about Romeo and me, and I can never tell them without destroying what little remains of their relationship with the Montague family. But I can't betray my marriage vows, can't pledge myself to another man, when my heart and soul belong to Romeo." The priest studied her anguished face, seeing in her expression the same desperate intensity that had driven countless tragic figures throughout history to choose death over dishonor. He had counseled enough Hollywood wives through scandal and divorce to recognize the signs of someone approaching a breaking point, and he feared what desperate measures this young woman might consider in her current state of mind. "There may be another way," he said slowly. moving to a cabinet where he kept various medical supplies accumulated through years of ministering to the entertainment industry's wounded souls. I have here something that might provide a temporary solution, though it requires tremendous courage and precise timing. He withdrew a small brown bottle filled with clear liquid, its medical label indicating a powerful sedative prescribed for actors suffering from severe stage fright and insomnia. The drug, when administered in carefully measured doses, could induce a sleep so deep that it mimicked death itself, slowing the heart rate and breathing to almost imperceptible levels while maintaining the body's essential functions. If you were to take this tomorrow evening, before the wedding preparations begin, you would appear to die in your sleep, Father Lawrence explained, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was suggesting. Your family would postpone the ceremony, and during the funeral preparations, I would ensure that your body was placed in the Capulet mausoleum. The drug's effects last approximately 48 hours, after which you would awaken as if from natural sleep. Juliet leaned forward, her dark eyes bright with desperate hope as she grasped the implications of his plan. And then? I would arrange for Romeo's release through a contact I have in the legal system, a judge who owes me several favors from years of discreet counseling during his own marital difficulties. We would present your resurrection as a miracle, proof that God intended your marriage to heal the breach between your families. Faced with such divine intervention, surely even the most stubborn hearts would be moved to forgiveness and reconciliation. The plan was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and absolute faith in Father Lawrence's ability to coordinate multiple moving parts while maintaining the deception. If anything went wrong, if the drug's effects lasted longer than expected, if Romeo couldn't be reached with news of the plan, if her family discovered the truth before the designated moment, the consequences would be catastrophic. But as Juliet held the small bottle up to the lamplight, watching the liquid catch and refract the golden glow like captured starlight, she felt something approaching peace settle over her troubled heart. The solution offered not just escape from an unwanted marriage, but the possibility of transforming their tragedy into triumph, their star-crossed love into a force for healing and change. Friday evening arrived with the kind of spectacular sunset that had made Los Angeles famous, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have provided perfect lighting for any romantic scene. But in the Capulet mansion, the approaching night held no beauty for Juliet, who sat at her vanity table in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a privileged Hollywood upbringing, signed photographs from famous actors, programs from countless premieres, and the white wedding dress that hung from her closet door, like a ghostly reminder of the ceremony she would never attend. The small brown bottle sat hidden beneath a stack of fan magazines, its innocuous appearance belying the desperate hope it represented. Father Lawrence had provided detailed instructions for its use. The potion should be consumed at exactly midnight, when the household would be deep in sleep, allowing her family to discover her apparent death in the morning when Maria came to wake her for wedding preparations. Downstairs, the mansion buzzed with activity as caterers and florists transformed the elegant spaces into a wedding venue worthy of Hollywood royalty. White roses and gardenias filled crystal vases in every room, their sweet fragrance creating an almost overwhelming perfume that drifted through the corridors like incense at a funeral. The irony was not lost on Juliet, who recognized that the flowers intended to celebrate her marriage to Paris would instead serve as decorations for her wake. At the stroke of midnight, as the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 12 times, Juliet lifted the bottle to her lips and drank its contents in one swift motion. The liquid burned her throat like fire, and for a moment she wondered if Father Lawrence had made a terrible mistake, if she was about to die not in appearance but in reality. Then the drug began its work, spreading through her bloodstream like a tide of peaceful darkness, slowing her heartbeat and breathing until she appeared to slip into natural sleep. Maria discovered her the following morning, the older woman's screams of anguish echoing through the mansion as she found her beloved charge cold and motionless in her bed. The white wedding dress became a shroud, the reception hall was hastily transformed into a chamber for mourning, and the flowers that had been meant to celebrate love became offerings to grief. But Father Lawrence's carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel even before Juliet's body was placed in the family mausoleum. The message he had sent to Romeo, explaining the deception and providing instructions for their reunion, was intercepted by prison authorities, who suspected it might contain coded plans for escape. The letter, written in the priest's careful handwriting, was filed away in an evidence locker, never to reach its intended recipient. Romeo learned of Juliet's death, not from Father Lawrence's explanatory note, but from a newspaper headline glimpsed over another prisoner's shoulder. Capulet heiress dies on eve of wedding. The photograph accompanying the article showed pallbearers carrying a white casket toward the imposing marble structure of the Capulet family mausoleum, while grieving relatives followed in black limousines. The news struck Romeo with the force of a physical blow, sending him to his knees in his cell as the full implications of the tragedy settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Juliet was dead, and he had been powerless to protect her from whatever circumstances had driven her to such desperation. His secret wife, his soulmate, his reason for living, had been destroyed by the same violence and hatred that had already claimed Mercutio and Tybalt. Using connections developed through years of family influence and a substantial bribe facilitated by his desperate attorneys, Romeo arranged his escape from county jail that very evening. He made his way through the darkened streets of Los Angeles like a ghost seeking redemption, driving a stolen car through the winding roads that led to the Capulet estate and the mausoleum where Juliet's body lay in state. The marble tomb stood like a small temple in the center of the family cemetery, its classical columns and ornate bronze doors reflecting the moonlight with cold beauty. Romeo found the entrance unlocked. Father Lawrence had arranged this detail as part of his plan, and descended into the underground chamber, where generations of Capulets rested in eternal peace. Juliet lay on a marble slab, surrounded by banks of white flowers, her face peaceful in the flickering light of votive candles that had been placed around her bier. She appeared to be sleeping rather than dead, and Romeo knelt beside her with trembling hands, marveling at how beautiful she looked even in death. Her skin retained its natural warmth, her lips were still rose-colored, and he could almost convince himself that she would wake if he kissed her gently enough. "My love," he whispered, his voice echoing in the marble chamber, "I should have protected you from this world that destroyed everything pure and beautiful, but I failed you, just as I failed Mercutio, just as I failed everyone who ever believed I could be better than the hatred that poisoned my family." From his coat pocket, Romeo withdrew a small vial of pills he had obtained from a corrupt prison doctor, a lethal dose of barbiturates that would bring the peaceful death that had eluded him since the moment he learned of Juliet's fate. As he swallowed the capsules, he lay down beside her on the cold marble, taking her hand in his and closing his eyes as the drugs began their final work. He died just minutes before Juliet awakened from her chemically induced sleep, her eyes fluttering open to find herself in the tomb surrounded by flowers and candlelight, and the lifeless form of her beloved husband lying beside her with an empty vial clutched in his hand. The scream that tore from her throat echoed through the mausoleum like the cry of a soul in torment, a sound of pure anguish that would haunt Father Lawrence's dreams for the rest of his life.